I'm Tim Henriques with a fantasy book ranking system. In today's review, we're going to take a look at Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. It is worth mentioning that this is a series. It starts off as a trilogy, and then it goes all the way up. There's a long series, Sword of Truth, but right now we're just going to review only the first book. So just book one of Wizard's First Rule. If you're not familiar with the fantasy book ranking system, it has a couple of purposes. My main goal is to simply help you, the reader, decide if this is a book that you want to review or not. My frustration when I review reviews on Amazon and things like that is you don't even know really what the other person likes. They don't ever compare it to anything else, and so you're kind of left wondering what use that review is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rank the book on a scale and compare it to then other well-known books. So then if I like the same stuff you do, we'll probably have similar tastes. If not, you can go elsewhere and come up with your own estimate. Also, secondly, just to be bluntly honest, I'm an author myself, mainly written non-fiction, but I'm trying to dip my toe into the waters of fiction, and so I wanted to see what made really good fantasy books tick and see if we can understand them just a little bit better. So the way I'm going to do this is twofold. I'm going to rank the books on 15 different scales, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being super awesome and pretty rare, 8's pretty solid, 6 and below is pretty weak. Definitely could use some work there. A few things I'm simply just going to describe the categories that don't involve a ranking system, and you can decide if that's important to you or not. I'll list what I perceive as flaws, then some strengths, then kind of my overall impression, and then ultimately I will give the book its own unique FaBR score so we can compare it then to other fantasy books and see how it comes out. So first, talk about how epic the story is. So we're looking at Wizard's First Rule, how epic is the story. So 8.5, it's reasonably epic. You got kind of a big challenge. It involves traveling across some different lands. Some interesting characters have to get together. So it's a reasonably epic story. Something like Game of Thrones, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings would get a 10, but this gets an 8.5, so that's a pretty good point. How well written is it? I thought Terry Goodkind did a good job writing it. He's got some cool ways of describing things. Definitely kind of gets you hooked and gets you going. So another 8.5. Good writing style, not sheer brilliance. Name of the Wind would be a 10, but 8.5 is definitely solid. How real did it feel? Pretty real. I mean, it is a fantasy story. There's magic taking place, but still, you can definitely feel like you're there as opposed to kind of watching a movie unfold before you where you're not an active participant. So I'd give this an 8. Something like the First Law trilogy or Game of Thrones would get a 10. What lessons are taught? Again, I think the author is trying to impart some lessons. I also should say I read this book about 3 years ago, and so I'm reviewing it off of memory based from that period of time. Not a lot of those lessons have then stuck with me since then. So there's definitely some interesting things in there, but I wouldn't consider that a massive strength. But I did feel like the author was trying to impart some stuff. So an 8 for that. Something like a Star Wars would get 10. Is the book a page-turner? Yeah, when you're reading the book, you want to find out what's going to go on. The characters are often in kind of tricky, dangerous situations, so you don't want to stop reading. I think the author does a good job of kind of hooking you, and then you definitely want to read through and find out what happens to them. So I'd give that an 8.5. Something like the Da Vinci Code or the Maltese Falcon would get a 10. How memorable is the story? It's, again, an 8. It's kind of solid. It's not unbelievably memorable. I certainly can't sit here and just trace the past of that the characters went through. But I can remember some interesting scenes, can certainly remember the kind of broad, overall, arcing path that they did walk. And could kind of relay the story in some semblance of a review, but I'd certainly be missing some chunks. So something like a Star Wars would get a 10, where you really remember almost everything that happens. This gets an 8. How memorable are the main characters? So there's 2 really main characters, one male, one female. They're both reasonably memorable. The male is kind of where the perspective comes from mostly, but so it's a little more classic kind of boyhood guys trying to grow up and discover some powers, and has the ability to kind of save things, and needs a female to kind of help him out. But they do have some different interesting twists on there. He has a cool mentor, which is a little bit interesting. So about an 8, but they don't stick with you. I had to think. I couldn't remember the second character's main name. The man's name took me a little while to kind of remember. So they definitely don't just like stick with you. Something like a Conan would be a 10, somebody that you remember forever after reading the story. Secondary characters I felt like were a weakness of this. I don't really recall There's a few, interesting kind of stereotypical secondary characters that are in there, but it didn't really stick out that much. You don't remember them too well, at least I didn't. So I don't think you necessarily think this is a huge flaw while you're reading it, but then afterwards you're kind of like, there really wasn't that much to those secondary characters. So it gets a little lower score here, 6.5. Something like a Star Wars would get a 10. Here's something that's kind of interesting. It's a little bit weird. I did enjoy the book, but when I was finished with the first book, I really had zero interest in reading any of the other books. And it wasn't the writing that turned me off, really the story. The characters go through so much punishment. They're both tortured excessively. At the end, I was just like, I have no interest in seeing them. Reading some reviews said that basically the same thing happened in the next couple books. I didn't really have any interest in seeing them go through that again. So the story had a reasonable ending. I was content. I liked closure. And it was a good story. I felt like it was fine. Let's close that book and move on. So personally, I didn't have really any interest in reading the next 2 books, and I have not. So I cannot give them a full review. How readable is the book? 7.5, I think, would be a fair assessment. It's reasonably well written. There's going to be some cool lines in there you can learn from. But again, there's a lot of kind of drawn out stuff. I don't think there's that much purpose. I don't think there's that much like deep lessons like Shakespeare that would be super rereadable. Something like Game of Thrones with just a kind of brilliant metaphors. So it wouldn't be in that category. How clear is good and evil in this? So here you can decide if this is important to you. I do personally prefer books that have a little more clear good and evil. This book was a little more murky. It wanted to show you some perspectives from the evil guys, good guys that are doing some things that might be evil to try to become good again, and so it definitely does. It isn't just like a super clear, like a Star Wars would be a very clear, good and evil, especially episodes 4, 5, 6. This one's more murky. The characters are doing some different things. Everybody has their own motives, so it definitely murkies the water a little bit, which some readers do like and can be done well. I thought this was done reasonably well. How prevalent is magic in the world? So first we're going to look at in the world and then among the main characters. This would get about a moderate. Something like a moderate is Lord of the Rings. So there's definitely some magic out there. Both main characters can use some magic, although they don't do it all continuously. And then among the main characters, moderate. And it would be closer to moderate high than moderate low. So because, again, especially both of those main characters can have some sort of magic powers that do sometimes show up. What age is appropriate? This is mature. The characters are going to get tortured. They're going to be like sexually tortured. I mean, it's not pornographic in nature, but it's definitely, there are things that are, described in there, and the main character has to have sex with his torturer and things like that. So definitely, it's not quite as graphic, say, as like Game of Thrones, but the things that are happening are just as bad, and they're described in pretty vivid detail. So I would say this is mature, certainly for me, and I feel like I'm more on the lenient side than perhaps other people might be. Is the series finished? Certainly the first trilogy is finished. I haven't seen if he's gone on. I think he's gone on to write a few more. I think it's a pretty long series. But the first trilogy is finished, and this individual book is obviously finished. Again, I'm only reviewing the first book all by itself, not the entire series. So flaws. As I mentioned, the characters just go through so much torture that I just didn't really have any desire to see them just be even more tortured. I mean, I like both of them, and then you just kind of feel for them, and you're just like, oh God, does the author hate these people, or what's going on? So that was just pretty brutal. The secondary characters weren't super memorable. We talked about that. I felt like the characters sometimes acted or made choices that weren't necessarily totally in character. I was kind of thinking, like, would that character do that, or would I do that, or does that make a ton of sense? That wasn't excessive, but it certainly popped in my mind a few times. The specific plot points aren't super memorable. There's a few kind of key elements in there, but not a huge amount of like, okay, again, I can just sit down and just tell you each chapter. It definitely blurs over time. My overall impression, though, it's a pretty good, well-written book. It's definitely a bit of a page-turner, so I could certainly see you getting kind of lost in it, which is nice. It's got a reasonably strong female character, and she has kind of like an interesting power, which is kind of cool that a lot of people, I think, will like. The first novel, for me, was a complete story, so it's not like a cliffhanger where you put that first novel down and you must immediately run to the second one. Really, it's kind of like, I think he wrote it, and then he was like, I can probably make more stories out of this, and then all of a sudden more trouble comes. He tried to show different perspectives of good and evil, and how everybody has their own motivations, and the evil guys think the good guys are evil, and all that good stuff. I thought he did a decent job of that. So again, I don't necessarily prefer that style, but it was in there. It's a little something different. It has some mature, intense scenes, both fighting and a little bit of sexual. So maybe you might like that or not. Sometimes I think that takes away from the stories unless it's just perfectly done. And then again, I didn't have any desire to read a next book, which is at some level a flaw. When I felt like, okay, it was done, I'm not interested in learning more about these characters. So overall, I'd give it an 87, which is a pretty good score, again, given that I didn't have any desire to read any of the other books. So it wasn't like the story itself just turned me off. It was more just like, hey, this is a complete story. I only have so much time. I don't really need to get invested in these characters again just to see them be tortured and then probably revived at some other level. So certainly by a standalone book, pretty good. Definitely check it out. High 80s is a good score, but not super phenomenal. And the series as a whole, again, I just felt like the first book was enough for me personally. So there it is. That's the FaBR score. Feel free to check out this YouTube channel or my website, timhenriques.com, for more fantasy book reviews. If you disagree with me, feel free to tell me in the comments, and we can see what's going on.